Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
that we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family,
regardless of race, age, creed,
Physical abilities, marital or economic status,
Gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
If you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
If you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
welcome home.
welcome home.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Crosspointe. My name is Stephen, and we're going to start with a song called Instrument of Peace. And the lyrics were taken from a really popular prayer named the Prayer of St. Francis. And this prayer has inspired Christians of all kinds for at least the last 100 years. So we're in really good company this morning, communally, as we sing and pray this prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. For in the giving we shall receive, and in the dying we're given life. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Where there is sorrow, let me sow hope. Where there is doubt, let me sow faith. Where there is injury, your pardon gift, your consolation to those in pain. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace.
Bring every doubt and fear. Bring all the shame you hide. 'Cause I've been waiting long as to take it and break every lie. Even the darkest nights, even when hope seems gone. No matter the distance, you need to know this, that I won't let you go. Come as you are. Come as you are to me. You're never too far. You're never too far away. Come as you are. You can find rest in me. You can find hope and peace. There's something to cling to. Daily it meets you and it starts here today. Come as you are. Come as you are to me. You're never too far. You're never too far away. Come as you are. Come as you are to me. You're never too far. You're never too far away. Come as you are. Come as you are. You must cease, awaken the heart, awaken the spirit, awaken the soul from death. You must cease, awaken the heart, awaken the spirit, awaken the soul from death. Come as you are. Come as you are to me. You're never too far. You're never too far away. Come as you are. Come as you are to me. You're never too far. You're never too far away. You must cease, awaken the heart, awaken the spirit, awaken the soul from death. You must cease, awaken the heart, awaken the spirit, awaken the soul from death. Come as you are. Come as you are.
Good morning, Crosspointe. My name is Kim Barnes, and I'm part of the children's ministry team. Got a couple things to let you know about that are coming up. We'll be holding a virtual family movie night on Saturday, February 20th. This is an all-day event that will include a drive-through to pick up a family movie package, a Zoom call, and a Netflix teleparty in the evening. You can find out more by going to crosspoint.org/movie night. If you're a parent at Crosspointe, you've probably heard us say that our goal in family ministries is to partner with parents. We truly believe that parents have the greatest influence on their kids' life, and it's our job to come alongside to encourage, equip, and engage with families. We know that we can do so much more when we combine our influences from home and the church together. And we also know that parenting during the pandemic has been hard, really, really hard. And one of the hardest parts has been watching our kids struggle, socially, academically, and emotionally. So we want to create some space to talk about that. We're going to have 2 community conversations. The first on Sunday, February 21st from 1 to 2 o'clock, and the second on Thursday, February 25th from 7 to 8 p.m. There'll be no agenda for this time together. We just want to have a place to talk about what's going on in our families and offer support to one another. You can find out more about that by going to crosspoint.org/conversations. I'm so grateful to be part of a community that does life together. And one of the ways that we do life together is through our giving. We can do so much more when we pool our resources than what we could do individually. If you'd like to help contribute to what's going on at Crosspointe, you can go to crosspoint.org/contribute or text crosspointenc to 77977. It's so great to be with you this morning, Crosspointe.
So with it being Valentine's Day today, it seems fitting that we're in a series called Heart Knower. And when we think about being aware of what's going on in our inner world, one of the most important things we can pay attention to is what kind of expectations are we carrying around in our hearts? Because whether we realize it or not, those expectations that we carry shape so very much of our day-to-day reality. Now, in the most simplest of terms, the dictionary defines expectations as the anticipation of something that is going to happen. And when we develop expectations, essentially what we're doing is we're painting a vivid picture in our head of how things are going to be, how things are going to look and feel, and often even more specifically, how the people around us will behave and respond. And those expectations can be both positive and hopeful, or they can be negative and cynical, and all sorts of ways in between. And while we may not typically think about it this way, whatever expectations we find ourselves carrying around are ultimately a reflection of what we believe. And this is important, that they're a reflection of what we believe about ourselves, about what we believe about someone else, what we believe about God, or just how we believe things work. For example, if you've been around me or listened to some of my teachings for any decent length of time, if I was to put a picture of my kids on the screen, how many kids would you expect to see in the picture? 2, right? I mean, based on what you believe to be true about me and what I've shared with you about my family the past 15 and a half years, your expectation of what you'd see is based on what you believe. Now, not surprisingly, we do the same thing with the Bible. For example, if I was to put up on the screen the name of the book of the Bible that talks about the Antichrist, most of us, if we spent any time in or around churches growing up or around Christian culture, most of us would probably say the book of Revelation, right? But here's the interesting thing. Nowhere in the book of Revelation does it mention a so-called Antichrist. I mean, feel free to do a word search on a Bible app if you want to, or on your computer. It's not in there. In fact, the only time the word appears in the collection of the Bible is in the very short letters of 1st and 2nd John, where it's found in only 4 sentences. And even more so, it's never used as a title for someone, a proper name. It's never used in reference to a specific individual sometime in the future. Rather, it's just this generic description used to describe people at the time who were against Christ or who behaved in a manner against Christ. And so in Revelation, where many of us would expect to find this description of some future specific adversary who's going to stealthily destroy the world like an enemy in a comic book movie, what many of us would expect to find is based on a false assumption that some of us may not even have been aware of till now in this moment. But again, that expectation is a reflection of a belief. And so in light of that, here's what I want us to wrestle with for the next few moments together. And I hope that we'll lean into this, because it's somewhat philosophical, but I really do think it's important. How many of our expectations of ourselves, of others, of how things work, and particularly our expectations when it comes to God, are possibly fueled by toxic belief and assumptions that we just picked up or inherited along the way? Now, to help us think through that, I want us to notice a moment where Jesus stops to address and confront people's expectations of him. Because at this point in Jesus' ministry, there's this building tension among the people of Israel. And we referenced this same context last week, but what they wanted to know was, okay, Jesus, if you're really the Messiah, if you're really the one who is supposed to rescue and deliver us, when are you going to actually do it? I mean, Jesus, when are you going to rise up and lead this revolt against Rome and put Israel back on top? When are you going to put Caesar and those who have oppressed us in their place and make things easier for us? You see, their expectation for what the Messiah was supposed to look like and what kind of kingdom the Messiah would bring was built on certain interpretations from sacred texts by religious leaders and certain assumptions that had developed over time and been passed down from generation to generation among Jewish people. And so as time went on, there was this underlying sense of, Jesus, you know what? I mean, healing people's great. Teaching us to love one another, I mean, that's great too, but we've waited long enough. If you're really the Messiah, it's time to conquer our oppressors and give them a dose of their own medicine. And so that's the cultural climate that Jesus finds himself here in Luke chapter 7, when he finds himself standing in front of a large crowd of people that had gathered around, and he says this, "To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other, 'We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not cry.'" Now, it would have been a very common sight in first century Israel to see young kids playing in the marketplace and pretending or play acting the rituals and ceremonies that they would have been most common in their world, particularly weddings and funerals. I mean, we still see kids play acting weddings oftentimes today, but at this time in history, weddings were marked by people playing flutes and people dancing in celebration, and funerals were where people would sing these specific songs of grief and mourning known as dirges. And so Jesus compares the people of his day to children in the marketplace who are growing frustrated because they can't get others to do what they expect them to do. They can't get other adults, they can't get other kids to join in their game. And in these brief couple sentences, Jesus highlights his awareness of the growing frustration among the people, that he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do, what they expected him to do, especially the religious leaders of the time. And that all of their expectations were being fueled by a belief and an assumption that the only way to deal with violence is with more violence. The only way to deal with oppression is to become the oppressor yourselves. The only way to deal with a situation is to act on whatever emotion is strongest in a particular moment. And I think many of us can find ourselves in a similar situation often when it comes to God, where based on our current circumstances, we develop certain expectations of God. Expectations that assume, you know what, if God is really God, then God should always do this. Or if God is really good and loving, then God would never allow these kinds of things to happen. But when we pause long enough to actually look at those expectations, often they're reflective of beliefs that are rooted in this understanding that the way things work are, you know what? If I do my part, God's supposed to do God's part. You know what? If I try to be a good person, if I participate in church, if I serve, if I give, if I pray, if I do all the things, then God is supposed to make things go better for me. My life is supposed to get easier. I'm not supposed to get sick. My loved ones aren't supposed to get cancer. I mean, since I've done my part, God should have made sure I had a job by now. God should have made sure I wasn't lonely by now. I mean, that's just how the way things work, right? Or maybe they do work that way. And what we start to think is, well, I'm just not doing enough. I'm not actually a decent person. God's disappointed in me. God is punishing me for that thing I said 20 years ago, that thing I did a week ago, or because I didn't go to Africa as a missionary when my heart got tugged by that emotional commercial on the screen, or I didn't share my faith enough, or believe the right things, or pray enough, or read the Bible enough, or believe hard enough, or whatever it is, and now I'm in danger. Now I'm on thin ice with God, so I guess I just shouldn't expect anything good. I guess that just must be how things work, right? And then, when things with God don't go the way we expect them to, when God doesn't do what we expect God to do, typically our starting point for reflection isn't an honest look at our beliefs and our assumptions that fuel those expectations. How we've interpreted things based on our particular context, how we've been told to interpret things based on who shaped us in their context. We typically don't start with questioning where our belief came from. Rather, we tend to conclude one of two things. Either I failed God, or God failed me. Either I failed, and God is disappointed and ashamed of me, or God failed, and God isn't actually good and loving like I was told. And ironically, this has been a cycle throughout all of human history, where people have lived with shame and fear that they've disappointed the, quote, gods somehow. And so they desperately try to figure out what ritual they have to do, what sacrifice they have to offer, what magic words they have to say to get God to pay attention, to get God to send rain, to get God to heal someone, to get back in God's good favor somehow. Or what we see happen is what happened with Jesus. I want you to notice what Jesus says next here in Luke 7 as he confronts the religious leaders' expectations of him. This is the next verse. It says, for John the Baptist, and John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. He was this prophet who came to prepare the way for Jesus by announcing Jesus' ministry. It says, John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, talking to the religious leaders, you say he has a demon. And he says the Son of Man, which was this nickname for the Messiah, a nickname for Jesus. It says the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, well then here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by all her children. Or perhaps it's better understood for us to see it that way as wisdom is proved right by what wisdom says she produces, by wisdom's actions, by the evidence of her life, of wisdom's life, which is such an important question for all of us to ask. What evidence is it producing? Or if we use the biblical language, right? Like, what fruit is it producing? Regardless of what label people want to use and accuse with, whether it's conservative or progressive or fundamental or liberal or biblical Christianity or some watered down false gospel heresy, I don't care what people label it or call it. I want to know what kind of evidence or fruit does it produce? Because religious people labeled and accused Jesus and his students in all sorts of different demeaning ways when it didn't line up with their expectations. And Jesus kept coming back to, okay, is the fruit good? Is what is happening, is what I'm saying good for actual people, for people's actual lives? You see, again, in this particular context, the concept that God would create a revolution through love and grace and compassion and generosity, it didn't fit with their expectation of a sword-wielding conqueror. So they labeled and accused and they made judgments. And because Jesus wasn't what they expected, they said, this is who you are. You're a drunkard. You're a glutton. You're a sinner. And in much the same way, when God doesn't jump through our hoops, when God doesn't cater to our expectations, we either swing toward shame, or we tend to respond much the same way as these religious leaders in Jesus' day did. We become like children in the marketplace saying, you know what? We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not cry. We played the game, but you didn't play the game we wanted you to play. You didn't live up to expectations. You failed. And we start to label and we accuse and we dismiss and we blame, we check out. We settle for playing some sort of religious game, just checking off what we think are the minimal requirements to keep a spiritual safety net in place, or we simply find ourselves throwing it all out, just rejecting all of it, anything that has to do with the divine. rather than putting down our flutes, stop playing the game, and examining our own assumptions and beliefs, and pausing long enough to consider where our expectations actually came from. Now, obviously, there is an unlimited number of expectations, particularly when it comes to God, where we could try to carefully examine the various beliefs that drive and fuel them. And that's important work that we're going to continue to do around here. But for today, let's just, for a moment, consider what you and I believe about God's expectations of us. Because here's the thing, for many of us, it can just feel like there is an avalanche of expectations coming down on us from God, where what we carry around with us, maybe based on how we were raised or how God was first presented to us, is ultimately this kind of list of do's and don'ts, or kind of a measuring stick of sorts of what God expects of us. For example, here's a verse from the scriptures that we often refer to around here where the Apostle Paul writes, "But the fruit of the Spirit, or the evidence of God's work, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." And the reality is it's very easy to get that twisted in our minds, and that list becomes very intimidating, where we read it as, okay, if we want to be on God's good side, then here's what every word and thought and action better look like in my life. And what it can start to feel like is that God has all of these expectations for us that are impossible to live up to all the time. And then to make matters worse, for some of you, you grew up in a home or around a church community where it always seemed like you were getting called out for not living up to God's expectations. That somehow, without you knowing it, certain people were put into your life on behalf of God to point out all the ways you weren't measuring up. And for some of you, that constant barrage of expectations and your inability to measure up is the reason you distanced yourself from anything having to do with God and faith. And frankly, for a while, that boundary that you felt like was needed just to survive, because the constant bombardment of guilt and shame from the toxic religious shrapnel raining down on you was just too much. And that was a boundary that you needed to put in place. And as a side note, for what it's worth, in my opinion, I think God honors that. When it was in our best interest of health, because God is always for us. God is not for some religious system. God is for our actual lives. And still, for others of you though, this weight of expectations that you can find yourself carrying, the way it affects you is it keeps you quiet about what's really going on in your life, what's really going on in your home, in your relationships, at the office, in your inner world, these destructive habits that you're desperately trying to hide, all the ways that you don't want anyone to know that you're falling way short of expectations, but still you just try to put on your best face, to keep smiling, to always answer fine when someone asks you how you are. Because the last thing you want is to be judged by everybody for not measuring up more so than you already feel like you don't measure up. And so here's what we have to understand. That view of God's expectations of us fuels a belief about God that frankly is the farthest thing from good news. That a God who sees and knows everything, that we assume is just somehow waiting around for you and I to mess up and point out how we failed, that's not good news. Or even if God's not doing that, we can assume God is just in this constant state of disappointment and frustration with us for not measuring up as a human, not measuring up as a husband or a wife or a provider or a parent or even as a Christian. And we think, I'm sure God may love me because, God has to and it's God, but I'm pretty sure God doesn't like me all that much and God's disappointed in me most of the time. That's how we can think. And so understand, here's the natural conclusion that comes to any of us who think that way. Well, then why would I want to try to get more connected to God only to find out more ways that I'm failing? Why would I want to get more connected to God only to find out more ways that I'm not doing it right? Now, that may not be the way you approach God, but for many of us, our life experiences and our relationships with family and sometimes our relationships within the church have taught us that God has certain expectations of us. And in turn, we have taken those expectations and we have turned them into standards to live up to, some kind of holy measuring stick. And for those of you who wrestle with that, here's what I want you to consider. What if God isn't like that at all? What if God's expectations aren't standards to live up to, but rather, as we talked about a few moments ago, what if God's expectations are actually a reflection of what God believes about us? What if God isn't actually the problem? What if it's the way we understand expectations? Because you see, often in our own insecurity and our own neediness, what we find ourselves doing is constantly turning the expectations we have of our kids, our spouse, a friend, boss, parents, in-laws, whoever it is. What if we keep turning those expectations not into a reflection of what I believe about those people, what I believe about their heart and their potential, but rather things I find myself demanding of them, requiring of them to meet my approval, standards that they need to live up to stave off my disappointment, to stave off my anger. You know what? You better do this. You better do that. So help me, you better not do that thing. And then what if I naturally assume that God carries that same kind of insecurity and neediness that I do? That somehow God is wounded and needs to demand things from us. How would that shape how I view God? But here's what we have to be reminded of. God doesn't actually need anything from us. God's motives aren't fueled by insecurity, and God's expectations are not demands. God doesn't need something from you or I. Rather, God wants something for you, for us. God believes in you. And as simple as that may sound, I imagine some of us just need to be reminded of that today. That regardless of what you expect and believe about God, God still believes in you. And so, how might that change? How might things change if you and I began to see God's expectations that you find all throughout Scripture as a reflection of what God believes about you and I? What if when we came upon lists like we find in the Bible, like we looked at earlier, like the fruit of the Spirit, where it says God's Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. What if we didn't see them as a list of expectations to live up to, but rather, what if you and I began to hear God's heart behind that? What if our perspective on God was reoriented around God's belief in us? Perhaps if we did, God's voice in our head as we read that would sound something like, I want to come alongside you and help you because I see you capable of extraordinary love. I see you with the potential for incredible joy in spite of your circumstances. I believe you have the tremendous capacity to foster peace in the midst of dissension. You have the ability to astonish people with your patience. You have the incredible potential to shower goodness and kindness on so many people. You have this built-in capacity to exhibit extraordinary faithfulness and self-control. And I see glimpses of it in you all the time. And you can live this way. This is where I want to lead you. And when you don't, what if we heard God saying, you know what? I'm not going to condemn you. I'm not going to mock you. I'm not going to heap guilt on you and crush you with my disappointment. I'll keep believing in you, dusting you off when you fall and helping you stand back up, cheering you on. Because friends, isn't that what we expect any good parent to do? Right? Like when you fall off the bike, a good parent isn't like, I am so done with you. I mean, how can you be so uncoordinated? I can't believe you're actually my kid. I don't even know how you're my kid. We all know a good parent wouldn't do that. Any parent that did, we wouldn't call a good parent. A good parent would pick their kid up, dust them off, and help them try again. So think about that. How much more then should we expect that same thing from God? I mean, that's been one of the most helpful filters for me in the past several years. And it's why I'm so grateful that Jesus continually gives us this metaphor of a parent to understand God's heart toward us. Because if someone tries to convince me to assign some action or behavior to God that all of us would condemn as hurtful and toxic if a human parent acted that way toward their child, then I'd dismiss it. I'm like, yeah, that's not who God is. Because think about it. Who among us would actually expect a human parent in all of our own brokenness to be more loving than God? To be more good than God, more forgiving than God, more patient than God? I mean, you and I can't be more loving than God, right? That just doesn't logically make any sense. You see, and that brings us back to expectations. What we expect from God is a reflection of what we believe about God. And what God expects of us is a reflection of what God believes about us. It's just how it works. Now, obviously, I wanted to spend the majority of our time today wrestling through how we see God and how we view God's expectations of us. But as I wrap this up, I want to offer you a few brief reminders about how this translates into how our expectations shape how we love other people. So, just a few quick reminders for you. 1, the fastest way for an expectation to morph into shame or resentment is for it to go unnoticed. It's the fastest way for it to go unnoticed. And so you and I have to do the work of pausing and checking the expectations that we actually have in any given moment. For example, as a parent, I remember having to pause and check my expectations of my kids. And I still have to do it several times through the years, where what I was expecting of them in a particular moment was to respond in a situation like an emotionally mature adult would. And I have to be like, okay, wait a second, they're 5. They're 5 years old, or they're 10 years old, or they're 17 years old. Why am I expecting them to act like they're 45? Or why am I expecting them to respond and feel exactly like I would in the same situation at this age in my life, when they're not me and they haven't had the same life experiences and perspective I have? And you see, when those expectations go unchecked and they go unnoticed, it's easy to resort to shame to try to control the situation, to try to control someone's behavior, or we just let resentment build up. Same thing would happen in our marriage early on, where I didn't even notice I had this expectation that every time I loaded or unloaded the dishwasher, I subconsciously was expecting my wife to celebrate me. And when she didn't, this frustration and this resentment would start to build up in me because I failed to notice that expectation and keep it in check. Because after all, I didn't do backflips and cheerlead my wife every time she did the dishes or did the laundry. But somehow, stupidly, I was carrying this expectation that she should do that for me. And this resentment would build up, and this frustration, and me trying to figure out how to get her to celebrate me, how to manipulate that so I could bang the dishes louder or do whatever it was so I could draw her attention. You see, that's why we have to stop and notice what expectations we're bringing into a moment. And for some of us, there's so much a part of our psyche that it's just become normal to us, where we find ourselves living in such a way that it suddenly shows up in our mindset like, you know what, I can only feel good about myself. This is how we think. If I can only get others to notice me, if I can get them to compliment my clothes or say something nice about me or my shoes, then I can finally relax and feel good about how I look, about who I am. Or, you know what, I can only feel at peace. I'll only be able to rest if I can get this person to agree with me. If I can get this person to see things my way. And what happens is our self-worth ends up riding on our ability to control other people's behaviors, to control other people's feelings. And when we can't, resentment and shame take up residence inside of us. So again, that's why we have to pause and notice what expectations we have and continually do the internal work of trying to keep them in check. Here's a second thought. 2, how could our relationship with loved ones improve if we saw and communicated our expectations of them not as demands, but as a reflection of what we think and believe about them? For example, with a teenager, what if when they screwed up, it sounded more like, hey, what's going on inside of you? This isn't who you are. This isn't who I know you to be. I know who you are. I've seen you. You're kind. You're responsible. You care about other people. So what's going on in you that made you forget that for a moment? Because this thing you said, that thing you did, that's not you. That's not who you are. I know that. You know that. So what's going on in you? You see, reframing our expectations as a reflection of what we believe about them, rather than something we're demanding from them, something we're trying to get from them, that invites trust. And that's not just true of teenagers, it's just true of people. It's true how healthy relationships work. And so it's good for us to wrestle with the question, how can my expectations be communicated to this loved one as a reflection of what I believe about them, rather than simply something I'm demanding from them? And then lastly, this is simple, but it's critically important. Don't expect someone else to make you happy. Again, nothing will fuel resentment and shame faster when this expectation goes unnoticed and unchecked. You and I are responsible for our own happiness. It's not anyone else's responsibility. But when we find ourselves carrying around this expectation, we'll guilt people, we'll shame them, we'll manipulate them, we'll beg them, intimidate them, threaten them. We'll use all sorts of gross and toxic things to try to do it because we start to believe that it's someone else's responsibility to make you and I happy. That somehow we have to figure out how to extract our happiness from them. And so we use them because it's their responsibility to make us happy. And when they don't, we get upset. We resent them for it. And then understand, in much the same way, you can't control someone else's happiness either. It's not your responsibility. You ultimately can't control their feelings. And that's a responsibility they have to take. It doesn't mean that you don't serve and love and be generous and kind to others. It's just embracing that regardless of what I do, I don't ultimately control how they feel. That's on them. That you and I can only take responsibility for what each of us can control. And learning to let other people have to take responsibility for their own happiness is a very freeing and healthy thing to do. And then, just as much, we can't make it God's responsibility to make us happy either. God falls into that we can't allow someone else, depend on someone else to make us happy. Otherwise, it becomes, well, God, what if you don't answer my prayers the way that I want, if you don't do this or that, or you don't show up for me this way, then I can't be happy, which again leads to either resentment of God or shaming ourselves for not being worthy enough or good enough because we didn't believe enough or pray enough. And so a lot of freedom starts to come when we finally embrace that we can't expect someone else to make us happy. That instead we take responsibility for our own feelings. We take responsibility for our own inner world. Now, obviously there's a ton more we could talk about today in regards to all of that and so much more that we could unpack. But friends, that's what I have to offer you today. And I hope that it's helpful. And I hope it's helpful in all of us. Learning to put down our own flutes. Learning to stop playing this game of expectations that we play with people that are fueled by beliefs and assumptions that aren't actually true. And we would reframe the way we all see God and how we think God sees us and in a way that aligns with the heart of Jesus. And that, as always, that will translate into how we love ourselves and how we love others better. Here's to being that kind of community. Love you, friends. Have a great week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.